So as you can probably see here, I didn't necessarily have my busiest month of reading for May 2020 as far as tackling my TBR, but I was pretty effective, all things considered, with COVID-19 and the murder of George Floyd in the streets of Minneapolis, Minnesota, that's touched off the civil unrest not only in the US but around the world. And so while that's occupied a lot of my thinking, I still did manage to get a solid 5 books read in the month of May. Not quite at the goal that I set coming into the month, but all things considered, I'm feeling pretty good about what I was able to accomplish in terms of reading in the month of May. I'm going to talk about what I read next. The first book that I read in the month of May was The Holdout by Graham Moore. And now this is a book that I saw, I guess Amazon's algorithm was really trying to hit me up to buy this book for quite some time. And so it kept popping up and popping up and popping up. And finally I decided to pull the trigger on it. Now I will say that, and I've said this in another video before, that I'm not always a big fan of courtroom books, movies, TV shows. So I was a little bit reluctant from that standpoint to take the plunge on this one. But nonetheless, I decided to pick it up, and eventually I did decide to read it. And so The Holdout was, it was really a solid read. I'm going to, just a little bit about it right here. A jury on a murder trial is deadlocked when a young woman manages to turn the tide to acquit. A decade later, she must face the consequences when a fellow juror is killed and she is the prime suspect. So you got kind of a mystery going on with dual timelines. The timeline from back when she was able to persuade the jury to go in a different direction, and then the current murder mystery. And so it's essentially you get 2 mysteries for the price of one. You get like a BOGO, buy one, get one. So it was, at times it was a little bit of a tough read. Because I found myself more interested in the current timeline than in the older timeline. And I think sometimes that happens for me when I'm reading books with the dueling timelines. It's usually one that I prefer over the other, or when it's dueling perspectives. Sometimes there's one perspective that I prefer over the other, and then you forget that it's kind of like a puzzle, and all the pieces, if the book is done right, they're supposed to fit together so that the book makes sense. So they run parallel, and then eventually they converge in the middle, coming down the stretch to the end of the book. And so that's what happened here. And I saw a lot of criticism of this book from people, and I try to really avoid diving too deep into the Amazon and Goodreads reviews until after I've actually finished the book, because a lot of times people give away what actually happens in the book, and it kind of spoils the book from a reading perspective. And so I try to really avoid that. But after I finished reading it, like literally right after I closed the last book on the last page, I went in and started reading some of the reviews, and some of them were kind of negative, and people were a little bit critical of it. You know, a couple things that people were critical of is that, well, one thing that I remember being really critical of is that it gave away the ending of a book that I was actually looking forward to reading, an older Agatha Christie book, Murder on the Orient Express, which is actually behind me here on the bookshelf. And so I was a little bit annoyed by that. And the book does have its share of flaws. But it was a book that I finished. I did not DNF it, and I didn't skim it very much. It actually did hold my attention from start to finish. And if you know me well enough by now, you know that that's something that's kind of difficult. But I did manage to stick with it, and it ended up being an interesting read. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I would probably give it 3.5 out of 5 stars. It was a solid book. It was kind of interesting. Some of the characters maybe weren't as developed as maybe I would have liked, and some of the characters weren't, frankly, very likable in this book. That's not necessarily a prerequisite to liking a book, but I thought it was kind of interesting that some of the characters were very, very unlikable. But The Holdout, I did end up giving it 3.5 stars. All right, and I hope I don't lose any viewers by doing this, but I'm going to go to a nonfiction book. It is called Game Face. It's I guess an autobiography by Bernard King. And he was a great player, mainly in the 80s when I first started discovering basketball. And I really wanted to learn about his experience, because I know that he dealt with some issues of racism when he was in college that I'd heard a little bit about, but didn't really learn as much about as I wanted to, and so I was really excited to read that. But I first discovered Bernard King, the great player that he was, when he was playing against my Detroit Pistons, when I first discovered that I had a love for basketball. And so I wanted to learn a little bit more about what he was sneaking in. And then later in his career, he had a tragic knee injury when he was at the pinnacle of his career, and he went down with a knee injury that nowadays it would be almost routine to come back from. But when he came back from it, it was pretty phenomenal at that time. And he came back and ended up playing at a very, very high level toward the end of his career. So it was really a fascinating read. I really enjoyed getting to learn a little bit more about Bernard King, the former New York Knicks player mostly, and then he played with the Washington Bullets team toward the back end of his career. So really interested in learning more about him. So I was excited about that. I am a sports fan, so in case you didn't know that, but it was really good. There are definitely some life lessons in here that I think are applicable for a lot of people. If you're not a sports fan, you might not be able to get into it quite as much, but I did enjoy it. So I ended up giving this one, I think I gave it 3 stars for Game Face by Bernard King. Okay, back to fiction. Hopefully I didn't lose a lot of you here. And next we go up to We Are the Wildcats by Sivan Vivian. This was a book that I pre-ordered a long time ago, and I was really excited to get it. It's about a women's field hockey team, actually a girls' field hockey team, in high school, and it basically takes place in a compressed time period, 24 hours, and it deals with some uncomfortable issues, some triggering issues, including a relationship between coach and player and some manipulation and things that are going on in the story, and kind of a coming of age, a discovery type story toward the end. But it was really kind of a fascinating read. I really enjoyed it. It's one thing about it was a little bit longer in some ways. I think I'm looking at it right now, and it was a little over 350 pages, so actually not too bad. It was the beginning was really kind of grabbed me quite a bit in the beginning, and while they're building the characters up over the course of the book, it can kind of drag a little bit because there are a lot of characters and there is a lot of character and world building, so to speak, in this book, and so that can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge, but I was really interested in seeing where it was going to go, and I liked the way that it infused the text messaging and the authentic text messaging language and the use of the emojis and things like that. I thought were really interesting, and I really enjoyed that it was told in that kind of a fashion. And so it came down to the end, and I was really excited to finish it and see how it ended. And so it ended up being really an enjoyable book. I liked it quite a bit. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. I would be comfortable rounding up to 4. It was a really solid and fun read. Would definitely welcome an opportunity to read more by this particular author. I will say this, it bookends really well, starts really well, and it finishes really strong. It was a very, very strong finish to this book. So We Are the Wildcats by Sivan Vivian. Next up is an item from my first Book of the Month box, and that is Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. Now, I'm going to be really, really, really honest here. This is normally not the kind of book that I would go for. But the one thing I was intrigued by, even though there's a lot of fantasy stuff going on, and there's just kind of like a darkness to it, there's kind of a supernatural thing type situation that's going on. The thing that really intrigued me about this book is I liked that it took place on a college campus, Yale University, and I liked the backstory of Galaxy Alex Stern, because that just really grabbed me right off the bat, like why she was recruited to fulfill this role that allowed her from not exactly a privileged background to be able to have basically a full ride to Yale University. I mean, they don't exactly hand those out on silver platters. So I was really excited about it from that standpoint. And then, kind of the secret societies thing was kind of intriguing as well. But really, I think the setting on the college campus and Galaxy, Alex Stern. Those were kind of exciting for me, but as I got into the story, it just wasn't working for me. It doesn't mean I can understand how it worked for a lot of people who might be interested in this genre of book, but it wasn't really working for me. Plus, I was a little disappointed. I didn't feel like the Alex Stern character was developed as much as I wanted. I was really more interested in her, and I felt like she was kind of flat through most of the book, and so I really just kind of struggled there because I was really interested in her story more than anything, and she was just kind of there but not featured as much as I was hoping. So it was an interesting book, and I did end up finishing it. I skimmed a little bit. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not gonna front. I did skim a little bit, but it was an interesting book, and again, I don't know that I would necessarily go for this kind of book again, but I do want to expand my reading. I want to expand my reading preferences, and so I was willing to give this one a try. So I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. And then lastly, the book that pretty much everybody's talking about right now, boom, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. And this is the much anticipated book. It's a prequel to the Hunger Games trilogy, the original Hunger Games trilogy, and it follows President Snow and his early years. And this is like, I think it's like 50 or 60 years before the Hunger Games as we know it, with Katniss Everdeen. And so while some people were pretty down on that aspect and upset that it didn't focus on other characters like Haymitch, which I totally get it, because that would be more interesting probably to me at first thought. That's probably where I would go. But at the same time, I was kind of excited to learn more about Snow and how he got to where he was as we knew him in the original Hunger Games trilogy. So it was a good read. It is a long book. It is a long ass book. I ain't gonna lie. Over 500 pages, and that's usually for me. That's usually like no, I'm not gonna even go there. But you know, because I was so because I really fell in love with the Hunger Games trilogy, and again, Hunger Games is not something, and the Hunger Games books are actually behind me right there. You know, Hunger Games was originally not something that I felt like I would be interested in, but I decided to give it a go anyway, just because I felt like it just sounded interesting when I saw the previews of the movie, the trailer for the original Hunger Games movie. I thought, you know, this might be kind of interesting, and so I gave it a try, and I loved the original Hunger Games book. And I really liked Catching Fire, and I endured Mockingjay. So when I had a chance for The Battle of Songbirds and Snakes, as soon as I saw it, I pre-ordered it. I think I pre-ordered it in October of 2019, and when it came hot off the presses, I didn't quite jump into it right away because I was finishing Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. So once I finished that, I jumped into The Battle of Songbirds and Snakes and read it relatively quickly by my standards, considering it's 500 plus pages. And so and I was pretty true to it. I didn't skim very much because it was an interesting story. I get that some people are critical of it. They don't like certain aspects of it, but I was really excited about it, and I just found myself wanting to just learn more and more about this story as it went along, and some of the key characters in this particular story, and just to see you know, how it started and where it went and how it ended was something that I was just really interested in. And I got to tell you, one of the things that one of the things that was really interesting with this book is Lucy Gray, the character Lucy Gray in this book. I was more interested in what was happening with Lucy Gray than I was in what was happening with President Snow before he became President Snow. So who knows what's going to happen if there's a follow-up to this particular book. Again, I don't want to give too much of it away, but it was a very interesting, very interesting story, and the ending was pretty intriguing. Kind of what I expected as I started to get closer and closer toward the end. But it was a solid book. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. was a little bit annoyed that they kept using Snow's first name just like way too much throughout the book. And yeah, I don't know. That was just kind of weird. Kind of bothered me a little bit because he's got a really long first name. So yeah, it just was it was a fascinating read, and you can kind of imagine the tie-ins with the original trilogy. So I really enjoyed it. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the fifth and final book that I read for the month of May 2020, ended up giving it 4 stars. For me, it was worth it. I know for some people they were critical of it and they're like not quite as excited about it, but I was excited about it and definitely glad I read it. It was worth the wait for me. So there you have it, my 5 books for the month of May 2020. A very productive reading month, not quite up to my goals that I set at the beginning of the month, but still pretty proud of what I was able to accomplish reading with some good books that I was really excited about. And I'm really looking forward to the month of June. I got some good ones on tap, and you can look for that in a future video on the channel. If you like this video, please consider hitting the like button. And if you're interested in BookTube and AuthorTube content on this channel, then please consider hitting the subscribe button and the bell notification to be alerted when future videos are posted on this channel.